Prologue, Mountie 019. A field somewhere in northern Ontario, Canada, December 26, 2020. I'd never flown in a plane before, much less a helicopter. When I was 16, Mateo and I took the train to Toronto to see a Leafs game. Even for the grade 8 trip to Quebec, we traveled in one of those two-story coaches with the tinted windows. Now, strapped to a yellow cot, wrapped in some sort of emergency, crinkly, sub-zero sleeping bag, I stared at the air ambulance that awaited me. It was painted orange, with the letters O-R-N-G-E on the side, as if they left out the A to save money. From above, its windshield extended a metal spike like a unicorn's horn, except this orange flying unicorn had only 3 legs, 2 in the back and 1 in the front, disappearing into a foot of snow. Through the haze of pain, I could barely see the evergreen trees that surrounded the field, serving as a barrier against the howling wind. The dark night was lit by the headlights of many police vehicles and the red and blue light bar of an ambulance. Overhead, the blades of the medical copter were whipping in circles, making the cold December air even colder. At least it numbed the excruciating pain in my chest a little. On the unicorn's tail, a tiny vertical propeller was also spinning like a windmill in a hurricane, proving how the seemingly inconsequential can alter the direction of the large and powerful.
Those are the dramatic opening paragraphs of the prologue to Much Ado About Corona, which is a book by Canadian author John Manley, which bills itself as a novel about real love and a fake pandemic that tells the fictional story of a very unusual, well, I suppose, romance that occurs during the lockdowns in Ontario, in a fictional town in Ontario in 2020 going into 2021. And it is an incredibly interesting novel, especially, I would imagine, for my readers, listeners, I should say, who are interested in exploring the madness of the world from a different lens, and one that is sympathetic to the worldview that I imagine many of my viewers share. And if you are interested in that, I will commend this to your attention. It's a book, as I say, set in a fictional town in Ontario during the lockdowns as the world descended into madness in 2020. And it follows a regular Joe named Vincent McKnight who travels down the rabbit hole, as it were, and ends up engaging in a romance with a baker who's attempting to keep her bakery open. No summary that I give of this story can really do justice to it in its fuller details, but it is an example of a phenomenon that I would like to think that my viewers are probably well situated to understand by now, but let's talk about it. Resistance fiction. Yes, that's right. Of course, recently here on Solutions Watch, I was talking about resistance cinema. And of course, you can go back in the archives for that podcast exploration. But today I want to talk about resistance fiction, which, as I say, is something that I have discussed a number of times. So I would imagine my viewers are already well situated to understand it. But here on Solutions Watch, for example, I've talked about writing a new narrative and how important narrative is to shaping not just our worldview, but then how we act in the world based on that worldview. You could look at subscriber exclusive videos I did. I did one back a few years ago on The Ring, as in The Lord of the Rings, and the allegory that exists or doesn't exist in that book and what it teaches us about resistance. I've talked about 1984, of course. You'll remember my episode 114 on Newspeak is double plus ungood. And of course, there is the entire film literature and the New World Order podcast series, the raison d'etre of which is, or was, or may be, to introduce people to works of, well, resistance fiction, resistance cinema, as well as dissecting some propaganda from time to time. So yes, I take it as a given that people out there understand the importance of fiction in shaping our worldview and thus shaping our reality. And especially when there are enough people who have reached a certain threshold of consciousness along these lines, it can be the ripple effect that truly changes the world around us. So, if narrative does change the world, then who are today's myth makers? Who are writing the narratives today that will shape the world of tomorrow? Well, as I say, this is one example of such a phenomenon. It's Much Ado About Corona by John C. A. Manley, who also has another book called All the Humans Are Sleeping. And this book is set in a different fictional universe than the Much Ado About Corona, but perhaps a related one, or maybe just further down the road, as it were. This one takes place in the near future, after a nuclear apocalypse of sorts sends people scurrying into the metaverse to escape the dreary, horrible reality of existence. And it talks about a couple of the lonely and lowly human survivors of that event who decide, well, who are or are not going to go into the metaverse. And again, it's a fictional telling of a tale that is already happening to a certain extent in real life, just not obviously to that far of an extent. So it allows the reader to see and explore the consciousness of what is coming down the road, what we are stepping into, why so many people are blithe to the real dangers that these technologies represent, and what should people be thinking about that. And I think both of these books do a good job of giving a fair view to the other side of the equation, to real human beings who have their qualms about, for example, the virus spreaders, or people who are, you're just an old fuddy-duddy who doesn't like technology. The people in these stories are not two-dimensional characters. They are fully fleshed out human beings with their own backgrounds and stories and motivations, which I think makes it a rewarding read. So obviously the links to both of those stories will be in the show notes for today's episode of Solutions Watch, so you can go and purchase a copy, explore these books for yourself. But I had the chance to talk to John C. A. Manley about his writing, about the concept of resistance fiction, and about the line between resistance fiction and predictive programming. To what extent are writers who are warning about a possible future actually helping to conjure that possible future into existence with their words? Some very interesting topics. So I started by asking John about Much Ado About Corona.
Well, I mean, with Much Ado About Corona, it was, March 2020. I remember sitting there watching the Prime Minister of Canada announce that we all had to go into lockdown. And that immediately, to me, I was just, every cell in my body screaming, this is a farce, this is authoritarian takeover. I didn't believe for a second that it had to do with viral epidemic. I was willing to believe that some of the politicians and other players on the lower level were actually believing it, but at the top, I didn't think it was very likely. And I felt very scared, not of a virus, but of where this was leading when they're telling people they have to all be locked up. I remember the Prime Minister getting up and criticizing people for meeting on the beach and how they had, just criticizing people for getting together in public. So I decided I just decided to start writing. I was actually in the midst of writing another urban fantasy that I've been working on for about a year. I decided just to put that down for a day. I wanted to write a short story about where I saw this going. So I typically write on the wall. So I taped a few pieces of paper to the wall and started writing a short story. And that short story continued day after day after day, where I was putting in about 1 to 2 hours every day, and I decided I'm just going to have to finish this. It was interesting, like I was saying, the Much Ado About Corona was originally set in 2030, like far in the future, where I thought that, well, not that far in the future, where I thought this was going, and I started writing flashbacks, and the flashbacks were set in 2020, which ended up being what the book became.
Yeah. That's an interesting approach. So you already know where this story is going. For people who haven't read it, it sort of ends on a cliffhanger. So there is more to this story.
Yeah, no, I basically I have it written to the end, but I got a lot of fillers, and I ended up adding so many characters to the original that I had to find a home for them or kill them off or something.
Yeah, I can imagine just keeping all those characters, all those balls in the air, and sorting out who's who, and oh yeah, this person over here. Anyway, beyond the logistics of writing it, obviously the question is, how did people receive it? And was this a surprise to people who already knew you and your writing, or did this introduce you to new audiences? Did this gain you some new friends or enemies?
Well, I definitely lost a lot of friends with it.
Mm.
I took 2 years to finish the book, so it was kind of a progression. Like when I was working on it originally, the criticism was extremely high. By 2022, the skepticism around COVID had grown significantly. Um, I'd say like I had relatives actually telling me, "Do not publish this. This is very dangerous. That you could get hurt or imprisoned." I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, the first year of the pandemic and scamdemic in Canada, I found was pretty totalitarian and was going in an increasingly that direction. Like I was, in addition to writing the book, also publishing like an article a day trying to convince people that this was a hoax, which originally I thought was going to be all I needed to do was just provide the information because it was so obviously a far-fetched. And I realized it was most people's reaction to the pandemic was emotional, not intellectual. So that's why I kind of started veering more towards focusing on the novel, because the novel is essentially, in a lot of ways, an emotional way to connect with people. I've been very surprised. Like, for example, I get emails from nurses or PSWs who are working in the nursing homes during the pandemic and saying that I really captured what was happening
Mm.
in there, except if anything, I toned it down a bit.
Mm. Yeah.
Because I had a lot of firsthand experience. The nursing home in our town, the military came in because it was such a mess. There was, residents who hadn't had their bed changed in like 3 days. They'd soiled their sheets and feeding tubes clogged, rotting food in the room. So I didn't want to make it that disgusting in my novel, so I toned it down a bit. But also just not the controversy, the conflict within the nurses about
Mm.
being in this environment, trying to do their best with staff disappearing, not being able to give a patient a bath for like 1 month. I mean, so it was, so I got a very good reaction and a surprising reaction from various nurses and people in the healthcare field who saw it firsthand. And I think, I get messages like, I thought I was going crazy. There was something wrong with me because everything, you know, I'd have to like shut down part of my brain to accept that what was happening around me was proper and normal and ethical. So on that side, I got that. I mean, mainstream media has totally ignored me. I've had several times where interviews were being set up with mainstream outlets, and soon, because I said I got a novel that really looks at both sides of the controversy, and I think I did a very good job in the novel of like the characters who were for the lockdown of actually giving them a real devil's advocate.
Yes. Can I just interject here? I wanted
Yeah,
to say that was one of the things I really appreciated about this novel is that people aren't just caricatures. It could have been very easy, I think, to write about the evil constable on patrol who's, trying to lock everybody down for no reason whatsoever, or just because he's a tyrannical asshole. But in this case, no, it's because he has a very, very personal, emotional reason for being attached to this narrative. And you drew that out in a way that really hits home. So I thought that was one of the greatest things about the novel is that people aren't just two-dimensional, character cutouts. These are actual human beings who have fleshed out stories for motivation of why they're doing what they're doing.
yeah, no, I appreciate hearing that because Constable Corona was an interesting one because when I did write him the first draft, or well, by the fourth draft, he was still a very two-dimensional kind of badass cop who just delighted in the power trip on people. And I had the draft shown to the cover artist, Jordan Henderson, and that was his response because he just seems like a 2D cutout. It's just this badass cop. So I scratched him, and this is part of the reason it took 1,000 hours to write the novel. But and I went back and I changed him. I made him older. He was just on the verge of retirement. He was kind of a thinner cop, but like you said, the reasons that he is doing this get revealed slowly throughout the novel, and his progression from basically probably being a real nice guy cop who was probably just trying to do his best. I'm not saying he was an angel, to what he becomes by the end of the novel, which is largely a result not of him but of the circumstances that he was put into by the government and the measures that were enforced on them. Interestingly, another character that people are really like I was really pleased to see that the response was so well to him was Raj, who is the one character in the novel who's kind of on the fence between, the resistance and not the resistance. You kind of get the impression he kind of buys into the whole COVID stuff, but he doesn't like the fact it's being forced on his friends and his family. So that character who was right on the fence, I get so many people say he was their favorite character, even though he wasn't a
He was
main character.
obviously an interesting character, and yeah, I was trying to figure out at times, like, is he on their side or not? I guess he kind of is, but not. Yeah, it was an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah. And then, one of the biggest things that happened recently was the Kirkus Review, which is a very prestigious magazine in the United States for reviewing both mainstream published books and indie books. They did a review of the novel, which it's an interesting review because it sounded like they really liked the story and the drama of it and the characters. Like they actually referred to it as having, really, I forget how exactly they worded it, but that they had really good character-driven scenes and action and intrigue. But the message behind the story, they were very on the other side of the fence. They had one line I've never heard before from a mainstream source where they said the novel is about the fearful versus the vaccine ready.
All right. Yeah. The fearful versus the vaccine ready. That's one way of putting it. So anyway, it was an ideological review, is what you're saying.
Yeah, they actually referred to it as they said that the ideas got weighed down by the arguments and with the characters, and I think to a degree they may have. I'll give them some, because I did feel by the end of it, I think the novel could have been just a little less didactic and done more through just the story itself versus some of the debates that some of the characters had between each other. So I'll give them that it may have just been a touch too on that side of the fence, but I don't know.
I could see that argument, but it's such an incredibly fine line to walk, and it's difficult to thread that needle perfectly. Of course, there is going to be some didacticism in a novel like this, but I thought it was refreshingly not just hitting people over the head, and there was enough, again, intriguing characters, even the main character who doesn't come into this from an ideological point of view, just comes into it from the outside, which I think helps the average reader sort of enter this world and this idea that they probably hadn't contemplated before. So I thought it was a powerful way of doing that. But then you write this incredible, fleshed out, detailed, hefty tome, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and leave it on a bit of a cliffhanger. And don't worry, you're going to get right to the next one. And then the next one comes along, and it's not the second part at all. It is All the Humans Are Sleeping. Tell us about this work and how it came about.
That one I actually started writing 20 years ago. It was a short story I wrote before my son was born. So it was originally a reaction to that scene in the Matrix movie when you see Neo wake up and he realizes he's been living in this pod his whole life. And that image, that scene in the movie really caused me to, I don't know, it hit me to the core. And that's what I love about stories, when you can get that feeling. It's a hard to define feeling and hard to arrive at, but that scene in the movie had that feeling for me, which I think we've had over and over again, both in the freedom movement or what we call the truth movement. When you wake up and you suddenly realize that, government is basically just a violent organization that threatens people's lives in exchange for their money. And we're all told to think it's this, nice social welfare thing that's helping keep poor people off the street and make sure that druggies get enough heroin through a designated clinic. And I'm being a little facetious there, but I'm also being accurate too. I had the same experience with the medical system. My late wife was very ill with kidney failure and type 1 diabetes since she was a child. And I went in kind of at first with, working with the medical system. I just started to gradually realize that there is nothing here about trying to actually heal someone, and that this is God's other ulterior motives, and no one's getting better. So, but they give this, so So anyways, all the humans are sleeping more directly was, I had this idea where, well, we saw this this is 20 years ago, so the move to like the metaverse, and the term metaverse I don't even think was used at the time, but virtual reality, like we saw in the Matrix movie, was an future possibility. For the record, I kind of doubt, and I think I've heard you say this too, I kind of doubt whether it's biologically possible to do some of this connection between humans and machines, but for the sake of the story and the metaphor, I went along with it. I'm also a bit skeptical of whether you can have a full-scale nuclear attack like I have in the novel. But again, it was a story device rather than trying to be factual. My son's very angry at me. He's like, but Dad, you're like, I know you're very skeptical about whether nuclear weapons can do this type of thing. Why did you put it in the book? But I wanted to give this option, like if we had the choice between going into a virtual reality paradise or living in real life, a lot of people will take the virtual reality, a lot of people want real life. But what if you just make real life, you basically blow it all up, which is what the novel presents, where there's a full-scale nuclear attack, and the remaining survivors are basically living in silos underneath the ground, which is not a delightful way to live. So And I thought it was parallel to what happened with like the COVID vaccines mandates, because it was like, you don't have to take the vaccine. You just can't go to a restaurant. You can't go to a movie. You can't get on an airplane. You can't leave the country.
You can't fly around the world. Exactly. Yes.
You'll be in it.
Part and parcel of the general, making the world crappier so that we'll want to escape into their digital nirvana? Question mark. Well, anyway, So it's again another compelling, gripping story with some people that again are fleshed out characters who have their own motivations, etc. But rather than talking about it, why don't you read a little bit about it? I was wondering if you could read a little passage, first set up maybe this passage, and then read a little passage from it, like the Spaghetti Farmers chapter.
The Spaghetti Farmers chapter. Yeah. You want to play a part?
Oh, I could follow along. Yes, sure.
Well, no, I was wondering if you want to read one of the characters. You want to be the robot?
Can you do a British? Yeah.
Can you do a British accent?
Do I have to do a British accent? No. Okay. I'll do my best.
You lived in, or you were in Ireland for quite a while, weren't you?
I lived in Ireland for a year. My parents.
We could do an Irish accent,
but I don't know. I don't know about my accent ability.
Well, and I also suggested this chapter because I wish I had read reportage before I had read All the Humans Are Sleeping, because this chapter deals with the Doomsday Vault. And I hadn't actually heard the theory that you brought up, that the Doomsday Vault was actually, possibly or very likely there to deal with a GMO fallout, type situation, GMO fallout type situation where we just screw up our food supply so bad we need to unfreeze some seeds.
To be fair, that's only one possible apocalypse for which this could have been created. I mean, take your pick.
Well, I took a pick.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so... All right. Well, each chapter starts with an epigraph by Dr. Marta Wink, which the story set in 2041, but the epigraphs are from 2291. Yeah, just one of the many reasons for locating the Jakavari Agricultural Station in the Tromsø og Finnmark County in the northernmost tip of Norway was to put it as close as possible to what was popularly known as the Doomsday Vault. Located on the Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, 1,200 kilometers north of mainland Norway, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault contained 930,000 varieties of crops. It had cost the Norwegian government 45 million kroner to construct in 2006. By 2042, the seeds it preserved had become priceless. Dr. Marta Wink, PhD, The Rise and Fall of 21st Century Man, Volume 3, page 213, Rebirth Press, 2291. Peter caught up with Rebecca just in time to see Domestical, the robot, usher her into her new room. She gasped. This is like a hotel suite. Domestical's stoic expression broke into another one of its silicon smiles. It looked authentic, but Peter knew it was a calculated response, rather than a true expression of happiness.
I went with a Victorian feel.
explained the robot, his British accent making the room feel all the more Victorian. Domestico stepped silently into the room and pulled a golden cord on a lamp adorned with a red, jacquard-textured bell shade and black fringe. Its light revealed an ornate desk made of polished wood and a framed video screen on the wall, pretending to be a window. The window screen displayed palm trees hanging over a beach with ocean waves lapping around a sandcastle. Rebecca sprinted through the doorway, leaping onto the raised mattress of the queen-size bed in the center of the room. She rolled over onto her back and stretched out her arms. "I feel like a queen," she proclaimed. Peter smiled, leaned toward Domestico and whispered, "Nice job, butler bot." "So," said Rebecca, "do I get breakfast in bed?"
"If you so wish,"
answered Domestico.
"I have been programmed in 42 different cooking styles, including Arab, British, Cajun, French, Indian, Italian, Mexican, Vietnamese."
"You mean you have real food here?" asked Rebecca as she fluffed the red pillow behind her head.
"We will,"
said Domestico.
"once we begin cultivating the greenhouse."
"Oh," said Rebecca, turning over onto her stomach and burying her face. "I guess that means we're stuck with loop poop." She pretended to vomit into the pillow.
"Loop is available,"
conceded Domestico.
"but I've also secured a supply of wheat flour, basmati rice, an assortment of dried beans, semolina noodles, dehydrated mushrooms and tomatoes, and a wide selection of frozen fruits, vegetables, fish, and meats. But if you would prefer, Loop..."
"No," exclaimed Rebecca, lifting her face from the pillow and inhaling deeply. "I'd rather die than force down another loop shake."
"We do not want you to die, Miss Stevens."
Peter could not help but hear sincerity in the robot's voice. Of course, these things could be programmed to imitate any emotion, better than most human actors. But for the first time, Peter was willing to entertain the thought that this robot might truly be on their side. "Tell me," said Peter, "what kind of seed do we have to work with?"
"We've been given full access to the entire inventory of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault,"
replied Domestico. "The Doomsday Vault," affirmed Peter. Domestico nodded.
"Thus we can grow just about every food crop known to man."
"Huh," said Peter, returning a lopsided grin. He'd read about the Seed Vault many years ago on the National Geographic website. It was buried in the side of some mountain in the Arctic Sea. Yes, that was right. The Norwegians had built it. Peter shook his head. Never in his most dystopian dreams would he have imagined he'd be the one who'd make use of its contents. Turning to Rebecca, with raised eyebrows, he said, "I guess that means we can grow just about anything." Rebecca rolled out of the bed onto her feet, skipped over to Domestico, and asked, "Can we grow pasta? I want to be a spaghetti farmer."
"Miss Stevens, spaghetti cannot be grown, but we can grow durum wheat, which in the base ingredient is the base ingredient in..."
"I know, it was just a joke."
"Ah."
The robot laughed with gusto.
"Very funny."
"It wasn't that funny."
"I apologize for my exuberance."
"You said there's pasta."
"Only macaroni noodles."
"Any cheese?"
"Parmesan."
"Benissimo," exclaimed Rebecca. "I'm starving." "That's for sure," thought Peter. Never fat, she had always been rather robust. Growing up on a farm does that to a girl. Living part-time in a human interface pod had done the opposite. His daughter approached him and put her arm around his shoulder. "Mac and cheese, Dad? You want some?" "If you're cooking." He extended his arms, embracing her. To his surprise, she didn't retreat. For the first time since the blast, he felt a flicker of happiness and a sliver of hope. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he knew they could make it, together. She squeezed him back and turned to Domestico. "I guess you don't eat, eh?"
"That is correct."
"Too bad."
"All the more for you two."
"All right," she clapped her hands together. "Take me to your doomsday kitchen."
"Of course,"
said the robot, and stepped out into the corridor, extending his arm and gesturing to the left.
This way, if you please.
A minute later, Peter was still smiling as he listened to his daughter singing her new hit single, No More Loop Poop for Me, while they followed Domestico down the long corridor. On the right, the sun streamed through the panoramic window. Below the window, for the length of the corridor, ran a railing, which Rebecca was using for support. Is she that out of shape? Thought Peter. And any more time in that pod, and she'd need a wheelchair. Ahead of her, she saw an approaching spider bot racing towards them along the floor. Before scurrying up and along the wall to avoid being trampled, his magnetic pincers clamped softly as it passed Peter at shoulder height. He turned, walking backwards, to see it disappear into the greenhouse. Turning forward again, he glanced out the window. The peak of neighboring Mount Vallisfari was casting an enormous shadow over the countryside below. Suddenly Rebecca spoke out. Dom, what's this? She was pointing to a metal door with a button in the shape of a downward pointing arrow. Normally, Domestico's responses were instantaneous. This time, Peter noticed a pause before it spoke.
It's an elevator,
Domestico finally disclosed. I figured that, shot back Rebecca. Where does it go?
The lift descends 15 stories into the mountain, providing a protected bunker.
Another pause.
With 24 human interface pods.
What? Peter exclaimed. What do we need those damn coffins for?
Simply as a precaution in case of a physical or psychological distress.
Peter was about to recommend dumping cement down the shaft, but Rebecca spoke first. You mean you can reconnect me? She asked the question quickly. Domestico tilted his head and said,
I beg your pardon, Miss Stevens.
I'm just asking, she repeated. You're saying that you have human interface pods down there that are connected to the metaverse?
Well,
said Domestico.
They are offline right now, but yes, they can connect to the metaverse at any time.
She put her hand on the door of the elevator and turned to face its metal surface. That's good to know, she said. You know, for emergencies. Peter realized he was holding his breath. Rebecca turned back to him and smiled. Let's go have some mac and cheese. She reached out her hand. Peter exhaled and clasped it. Then she let go and pulled back. Raisha, she said. She started running, letting out a happy yelp. Peter laughed. Everything's going to be all right, he thought. Or, at least, good enough. He turned to Domestico and repeated the challenge. Race, you purple bot. Peter lunged forward. His legs felt stiff. His lungs felt weak, but for the first time in 3 months, he felt alive. Up ahead, he saw Rebecca suddenly halt, sway side to side for a second, and then reach out to her right. Only the tips of her fingers brushed the railing before she collapsed on the floor.
Yay! Thank you. Very nice. Yes.
Very nice robot.
I think I need to work on it. Everyone in the comments, please comment on my absolutely terrible and offensive English accent. But yes, an intriguing little bit of the story. And well, as all I can say is it makes sense once you read it in its context. But I think that gives a sense of what this story is like and what it's about. Obviously, generally speaking, in the science fiction realm, and in fact, I believe it has been honored with an award, or at least a nomination for an award. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's been nominated for the Prometheus Awards, which is a specific, I think it's considered the third most well-known and successful or popular science fiction award for fiction novels, but it's specifically for science fiction or fantasy or kind of supernatural novels that have a pro-liberty and anti-authoritarian theme to them. It's been around for, I believe, about 27 years now. So each year they nominate. Right now, this year we have 14 nominations. I have two of the novels, other than, well, All the Humans Are Sleeping, of course. Powerless by Harry Turtledove, which is an alternative fiction set, and it's kind of hard to tell the date, around probably 1960 California, but it's an alternative history where the United States had joined the Soviet Union. So it's a really cool opener to this, because the man, he's assigned a flower shop, a vegetable shop where he sells vegetables, and each year they give them a new poster they have to put on the window of their store promoting true communism and that type of thing. And this guy, who's never been very rebellious, he just doesn't like the system. He just couldn't put the poster up that time, and that ricochets into so many things, which was similar to what I had done with Much Ado About Corona, because no one really did anything to harm anybody in that novel, but the retaliation from the police, which escalates to a point that if I wrote that novel back in like even 2010, you would say that was too far-fetched. And then, now it's like, so yeah, I got Turtle Dove. I got another Storm Dragon, which is more kind of science fiction. It's set on another planet. This is actually a young adult's novel set on a planet where they got a settlement where the government's very totalitarian, and it's about a boy and his dragon who help overcome the problematic forces in charge. So the site's run by the the awards are run by the Libertarian Futurist Society.
You know what? Let's pick up on that thread, because that's an interesting sort of junction of what we're talking about here: resistance fiction, but also speculative fiction, science fiction. And I have certainly noticed there is a libertarian anarchist bent in a lot of science fiction, and the sort of freedom spirit has been preserved there, perhaps more strongly than any other particular genre of writing. A, have you noticed that yourself? And B, why on earth might that be?
That's a good question. I'm kind of split down the line on it, because in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. Like, probably one of the biggest, examples of science fiction most people know is Star Trek. And that one, you could go almost either way with it. Sometimes it looks like a communist utopia, where it's like, though it's definitely always from a military angle, which actually kind of fits on the communist utopia angle. They kind of talk about, but then they got like the Borg, which is supposed to be like the super communist, to make the regular communist utopia look kind of good. Like, I kind of almost wondered why they didn't want to get assimilated, because it was kind of the direction they were all going. Yeah. But then on the other hand, it's interesting, because some of the like a really good science fiction series, I'm not sure if you've heard it, the Silo series by Hugh Howey.
In fact, yes, I know the TV adaptation of it. I haven't read the books.
You've seen the Apples? I think it's Apple's done a version. Yeah, because originally that was, interestingly, the origin of that was the author was retired boat charter guy, and he ended up just getting a kind of a day job at a bookstore, and he was writing these short stories, publishing them on Amazon. He wrote this one story called Wool, and I think it was about 10,000 words, and he started to notice it was selling like 3,000 copies a week all by itself. So then he decided, well, I'm going to write a few more chapters to this, and eventually became this 3-part Wool trilogy, which, is very much a top-down controlled government where everyone's living in these silos underneath the ground. And if you read the entire story, because they control people through deception, not through force, which, is kind of the direction everything's going, the kind of 5th generational warfare, which I think is partly why we see that theme emerging in science fiction, particularly because 5th generational warfare is a lot easier to do with technology. It's a lot harder to do in the Middle Ages.
Right.
Yeah, you could do it somewhat with belief systems and so forth, but it's a lot more work. People are just better connected. But it's interesting because Hugh Howey, the author to that, was like totally 100% behind the COVID mandates. And I'm saying this because you can just go to his blog, and he has long essays explaining why it was good to force people to take vaccines and to wear masks, which I think, gets into the whole issue of how much of this fiction is resistance fiction and then predictive programming, or is it reflective programming?
You know, that's such a fascinating question, because as soon as you mentioned, for example, the Matrix and that scene that, yeah, I'm sure a lot of us can relate to from our own rabbit hole experiences and waking up to the Matrix and jacking out and, oh my God, where am I? What's really happening? Is this what real life is like? Is a powerful and emotionally resonant scene, because it obviously represents an experience that a lot of people have of waking up to reality. But again, there's so many things around the Matrix. Not only, of course, Neo's passport expiring on 9/11/2001, but many other things
Oh,
in the
I didn't
Matrix.
know that. That's a good one.
Yes, someone figured out if you pause at the right moment as they're showing his passport, you can. You have to zoom in. You have to have the Blu-ray edition and like rotate the screen, but it's literally Neo's passport expires on September 11th, 2001. Anyway, there's beyond that. There's a lot of things that clearly in that movie speak to what we all went through in the process of 9/11 and thereafter, falling down that rabbit hole and waking up to the Matrix. But it really does. That is one of those works that really does beg the question of, is this predictive programming? Is it resistance fiction? What is the line between the two? And I go back, for example, to Orwell and Huxley, and just knowing what I know about Huxley and his family and everything that he was involved in, the eugenics and all of that, I hear him warning about the scientific dictatorship that's now possible and the ability to make people enjoy their own servitude and all of that. And obviously the warning that was Brave New World. But at the same time, I feel like he was slobbering a little bit, salivating at the thought of this scientific. Maybe I'm reading into that, but it seems to me that Huxley was more on the predictive programming side of it, whereas when I read Orwell and I read 1984, I see that as resistance fiction, and I see that as, again, setting the template for so much of what we now understand in reality and doublethink and all of these concepts that he introduced to the vernacular. But I'm sure people could, and I have heard people make the argument that no, 1984 was predictive programming too, as well, rather than resistance fiction. Where do we draw that line? How do we draw that line? How do you draw that line in the work that you're doing?
Well, with my work specifically, it was through the characters. Like, the character is an extension of me in a lot of ways. Like they say, everybody you dream about in your dreams is an extension of yourself. In the same way, I think the characters were. And, I despise totalitarianism in any form, like even when it's to make people be better and good and that kind of shaky stuff. So but at the same time, it can become. I honestly don't have a really good answer for it. Like I was finding it interesting when we were fighting the COVID stuff. I remember one of the people in our local group saying to me, it's like, how do people love the Hunger Games? Like there's all these people, all these kids and teenagers, they just love the Hunger Games, and yet they're strapping on their mask and getting their shot and hiding at home. And like, can't they see that this? And sometimes I'm concerned too, especially when it's more in the cinema arena versus the novel fiction, is that you can see these characters resisting and it kind of fulfills it for you. So you feel like, it's almost like with sports, a lot of people watch sports, they don't feel the need to actually play sports because they're watching people play sports all the time. So, you see Katniss with her, mighty arrows blasting tyranny out of the sky, and then you feel like you've kind of done it. I don't know if that's it. Because there is something about
in a way, isn't that kind of clearly people experience that perhaps more viscerally when they're engaged in a movie in the cinema. But in a way, that's similar to what you would take out of a book as well. And isn't that an indictment of all fiction? Well, then all of it is just our trying to live through these things so that we don't have to do it ourselves. What is the space then for resistance fiction to actually provoke real world action?
I feel it got to inspire, and it also got to face the fears. And that's what I tried to do in that, and actually do it in a fun way. Because I cover, especially in Much Ado About Corona, there's some very dark scenes in the book. Not as dark as it could have been, but there's also a lot of friendly banter and stuff. I really liked Josh Whedon, who did the Firefly series. I don't know if you've ever seen the Firefly series.
No, I haven't.
But it's an interesting series because it got canceled after like 6 episodes. It was so anti-government, anti-tyranny. It's set in the far future where this tyrannical government has one, and it's about a small band of people who are still resisting. And they purposely tried to get that show off the air because they put it like 1 week at one time, and the next week they changed the day and the time it was on, and just kept on doing that. It got canceled, and they didn't even show all the episodes. They threw all the episodes onto a DVD and said, "Well, just put it on the internet or on Amazon to make some money." The thing sold like crazy, so much so that they got a movie to finish the series up. Like a movie that followed a canceled TV series. Hasn't happened since Star Trek, but Josh Whedon's attitude with that, he says, make it dark, make it grim, make it real, but then for the love of God, tell a joke. So I tried to get that in there, but also I think I had to face the fear of like, what's the worst thing that I could do to these characters, especially the main character, without killing him. And I don't know. I think if you can have people go through all the fear and emotions that they're going to feel when they're trying to resist and come out the other side, then I think you have some hope of inspiring them. So, and that's the beautiful thing about the novel over the screen is you can get inside the character's head. You can't do that with the screen. So that's always been the biggest difference with novels over, not to put down movies. Movies have their own benefits and
so forth. It's a different art form.
Yeah, like the Jones Plantation's a masterpiece, for example. But you can get inside people's heads. You can become, the character can reflect back and forth between the reader and the character, and you have multiple characters. So there's one that they're going to latch on to more. So, yeah, I think if you can get them through the emotional journey, that's going to happen, and inspire them to get out the other side.
This is it. I mean, there are characters in books that I've read over the years that sort of inhabit my mind in ways that I'm sure I'm not even consciously aware of, but, that start to form your perception of the world and the way that you can live. And I think at its best, that is what resistance fiction can do, is at least implant the sort of the idea for how a hero acts in the world. Not necessarily, killing the dragon with your sword, but at any rate, how you stand up to tyranny and can provide that template. So I'd like to put the question to you. What is some resistance fiction that has inspired you in your reading over the years?
Well, I have to admit, I don't know if it's going to sound cliche or not, but To Kill a Mockingbird was a big influence on me. And and I think that novel, it had that same effect where, specifically talking about the discrimination against the black population in the South, but it did it all through a story from the point of view of a little girl. I mean, I think it took her like 10 years to write the book. So it was an intense, dense, extremely well-written book. So that's one of them. I mean, I know there's a lot of controversy over Harper Lee and her motives and all that kind of stuff, but as a standalone, it was good. Amor Towles, A Gentleman in Moscow, I had quite a bit of influence on it. That's a story about a man who's after the Bolsheviks, or not, I'm not sure exactly the dates on it, but basically when the Russians kind of went full capitalism, they took all the people with money and they kind of locked them up in house arrest, basically lockdown for the rest of their life. And it's about this one man who's told that he's not allowed to leave a hotel till he dies. So he's basically put in lockdown in a hotel, and he lives there for, I can't remember, 20 years. And you see him resisting in every which way he can. I don't want to ruin the ending. Very good novel. One of the ones has a lot of impact on me and it comes from a total communist, was The Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King. Because Stephen King is like I don't know if he's full-blown communist, but if you ever sat there and listened to
the way there,
I mean, I did a clip just recently with him, just saying how disgusted he was with people in Florida during the lockdown, just going out and walking around. It's like, what kind of example is this? But The Shawshank Redemption, which was a short story originally, to me is, it's about a man who's been captured by the state. He's been thrown in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And it's about how he fights. He does what little he can, and he has a very long-term plan, and he just perseveres every day with this very small effort that he can make. And I don't want to ruin it for anyone who hasn't read the book or seen the movie, both of which I think were excellent. So So that feeling at the end of that movie, when you figure out what he was really doing, that's what it's a story can capture that feeling. Because when I read Brave New Normal, I did not feel uplifted by the end of that book. I did not feel hopeful. I found it kind of weird. It was almost kind of like a really like twisted version of the Jetsons.
Do you mean Brave New World or Brave New?
Sorry, did I say normal?
Yes.
Sorry, I meant Brave New World. Yeah, sorry, yeah, Brave New World. My next book's actually called Brave New Normal. Yeah, sorry,
Nice
Brave
plug.
New World. The whole thing is just it's a disturbing story, I found, and I didn't feel like it was kind of like it's like watching, instead of watching Star Trek, just watching the Borg show.
Yes.
Right.
No, you know what? It reminds me of. I'm sorry, I should have pulled this off my bookshelf before we talked, but B.F. Skinner's Walden 2, which I did on my film literature and New World Order series several years ago. If you haven't read that, it's, again, such a creepy book. But clearly, to me, that is an attempt at predictive programming, not resistance fiction. But people can hear my film literature and the New World Order podcast for more about that. But yeah, same sort of creepy feeling about the Jetsons' future that they want us to be excited about, I think. But my God, does it not sound exciting? But you know what?
Is this about Thoreau?
No.
Okay.
It's about B.F. Skinner wanting to puppeteer people like they're pigeons in his Skinner box, essentially. Please do read it if you are interested. It is it's creepy and disturbing and exactly what Skinner would probably write about.
I should say just the last one, the author, which I think deserves good mention, was Ayn Rand.
All right, interesting. Yes. The funniest thing is, and I hesitate to tell this story, but back in university, I did have a friend who highly recommended Ayn Rand. And so I did read The Fountainhead, and I was so unimpressed with her as a fiction writer that I couldn't get excited about the philosophy. I thought, if you're going to write philosophy, just write philosophy. That's fine. I can read that. But this fiction was not, I did not like it. I did not think those were fully fleshed out characters. I thought they were tropes and ideas and, two-dimensional cutouts.
One of the problems with Ayn Rand's philosophy about fiction, like I actually have her, it's not here. I got a whole book on her. Oh yeah, here it is. Ayn Rand, she had a very she had a philosophy about everything in life, but she had this theory that she had to make these characters, like her main characters, these perfect human beings. She did want very black and white characters, and that I think was a bit of a flaw. But
didn't sit well with me anyway. Yeah, but I appreciate that a lot of people have garnered something from those stories, and hey, who am I to get in the way of that? But you know what, John, you have inspired me today because. Obviously, I am a reader. I've always been interested in reading and fiction. But as people know, I did do the Film Literature and New World Order podcast series for many years until I found that I just wasn't comfortable with the way that it was being received or not received by the audience. And I questioned whether and how to do a book club in podcast form with people listening in who 99% of them haven't read the book and never will. What is the point of this? What are we doing? So I have put that podcast on hiatus for many years now, but you are inspiring me to give it another try and to see if the audience will be along for the ride, if there is actual worthwhile engagement to be had from such a series. So I would like to invite you, John Manley. Would you be interested in being the first guest on the revivified Film Literature New World Order podcast?
I'd be honored.
Well, then, we will have to set a date for that and think about what book, resistance fiction, predictive programming, or other type of book we would like to talk about. And we'll talk about that off air. But anyway, thank you very much for your time, for all of this writing, these efforts that you've gone to. I know it is probably more of a compulsion than something that you're doing out of just the niceness of your heart, because that is the only reason people actually do put pen to paper usually. But I appreciate it nonetheless. And obviously this is going to touch a lot of people.
Yeah, I remember when, we were all kind of worrying whether we're all going to end up in COVID concentration camps or, just be shot or in lethal injection or all that kind of thing. The main thing keeping me up at night was I haven't published a book yet. I haven't finished the novel. So I kind of just combined the two. Well, I can fight this, and let's give it a try.
It works. Well, tell us about Blazing Pinecone Publishing. What is Blazing Pinecone?
Well, Blazing Pinecone was supposed to be kind of a metaphor. There's a theory that the pineal gland in the brain helps produce a lot of creative ideas and so forth. So and the pineal gland in the brain looks like a pine cone. So, and I kind of find when I get my best ideas, it kind of feels like that part of the brain. So it was a nice metaphor. And I didn't want to be one of those authors who just use their name, just johnmanley.ca. So I wanted something like that. So I realized, especially with Much Ado About Corona, there was just no point trying to get this published by a mainstream publisher because that was not going to happen. So, so I went indie publishing, which I don't regret at all. And so blazingpinecone.com, if people want to go there, I have the first 27 chapters of All the Humans Are Sleeping available in like ebook and audiobook format. So you can just go and listen to like 1/3 of the book. And I say, well, if you don't want to continue, then it's not your book. And then I'm doing the same with Much Ado About Corona. So, and that site originally was called muchadoaboutcorona.com. You may remember at the time, because I remember you gave me a mention in one of the Dino Awards. Because originally the site was just focused on every day I was putting out a new article whilst I was writing this novel, trying to stop the COVID oppression. Mm-hmm. And eventually, once the novel came out, I decided I'm going to go from the different. I appreciated reading in your book, James, because you started off as a would-be novelist and you turned journalist, and I sort of started off as a journalist and I went novelist. So now the world's all balanced and everything.
No. Now we have to go back the other way.
Okay. I'll start the Manley Report, and
yes, and I'll start Blazing something or other press. Yeah.
Can you write the sequel? Well, actually, if I do, I'm going to be doing of All the Humans Are Sleeping. Well, wherever it is, All the Humans Are Sleeping. I'm going to be doing a second edition of that slightly, because one of the criticisms I got over and over again was people were upset that Brent wasn't in the story enough. So I did feel I kind of gypped it there. So maybe instead, when if I do the second edition, when Peter says, he's read about the Doomsday Vault on the National Geographic website, I'll just change it to the Corbett Report.
I appreciate it. You don't have to mention the Corbett Report in every book, though.
Well, we should mention, fans of the Corbett Report will be happy to see when they read Much Ado About Corona, there is I think an amusing scene in there with the characters referencing the Corbett Report and the QAnon phenomenon.
Yeah, I appreciate it being contrasted to the QAnon people. So. Not like those people. It's like this. Yeah. Excellent. Well, John, thank you again for your time, for your work, for doing what you do. Keep at it. We're all rooting for you for whichever sequel comes out first. I'm assuming All the Humans Are Sleeping sequel?
Well, actually, as a prequel to Much Ado About Corona is coming out next. It's almost done. It's called COVID Disobedience. And I think, in particular, you might find it, it's set 3 months before what happened in Much Ado About Corona. It's set in two periods. It's set in 2020, right at the beginning of the lockdown, and it's set in 1846, July 23rd. I'm not sure if that date rings a bell, July 23rd. That's the day Henry David Thoreau got thrown in prison for not paying the poll tax. Oh. And what has emerged originally was just a short story, again, with Stephanie, because I had this story in my mind for quite a while, because it happened in Toronto, Brampton, near Toronto, where they were actually locking kids in their room for like 3-4 weeks at a time, like because they had a positive PCR test, no access with the rest of the family. So I wanted to do a story about that. So I have a story with Stephanie, and that oddly enough, Henry David Thoreau came into the story at one point. And so now what I have is two stories parallel. One chapter set in 1846, telling the story of Henry David Thoreau being arrested for not paying the poll tax, as incarceration, and eventually being let out. Whilst every other chapter is telling the story with Stephanie trying to help this girl in lockdown. And then the two stories come together. So that's going to be out soon.
I can't wait. Looking forward to it. And how do people follow you again? blazingpinecone.com?
Yeah, go to blazingpinecone.com. They can enter their name and email address. And, well, just their email address. I don't want their name. I don't mind, but I just thought it would save time. I have a newsletter that goes out 3 times a week, and they get free copies of the previews for the audiobook and the print book, and lots of other fun stuff. And so, yeah, blazingpinecone.com.
Excellent. John Manley, let's leave it there. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I hope you guys were as captivated and interested in that conversation as I was. I think it's an incredibly interesting idea to think about. Resistance fiction. What is it? How does it function? Where does the line between resistance fiction and predictive programming lie? How can we more effectively use narrative to help get people to understand our point of view? And who are the people out there who are doing it? All valuable and important questions to be exploring. So I'm glad there are people like John Manley out there who are exploring them. Of course, you can find out more about him at the Blazing Pinecone website, link in the show notes as always. And there, of course, you can find links to his works and start exploring that. But I think the question of resistance fiction and how it works and how it can be done more effectively and who is effectively doing it is an important one. And obviously, along those lines, yes, here, you've heard it here first. Film literature, New World Order, revived. Shall we give it another go, guys? Let's try. And I'll see what the feedback is like on this series and whether it is worth continuing it. But I think I'm going to try doing this crazy internet book club with the general audience that generally has not read the book and see how that works and see if there is anything good that can come of it. But I'm excited at any rate because I always am excited to read good fiction and to explore these ideas. So I hope people out there are similarly interested and exploring and also helping to support those writers who are out there attempting to put this in narrative form. Of course, you will know that I am such a writer, although my book is not fiction, obviously. I have the nonfiction reportage essays on the New World Order, which, as you know by now, 20 essays collected from 15 years of writing, and those essays are now available in hardcover and paperback, and there's an audiobook download, there is an ebook download. All of those formats, all of those versions are available, of course, at reportagebook.com and or wherever fine books are sold. And as you may have seen with my recent announcement, also Reportage is now available only for Corbett Report members, only for paid subscribers to the Corbett Report. You have the opportunity to get a special collectible audiobook data CD of the Reportage audiobook. So it's the whole audiobook, all 8+ hours on a single CD, but of course it's not a regular CD, it's a data CD. So it can be read in a CD-ROM or perhaps by certain MP3 CD compatible CD players if you happen to have such a thing. Otherwise, it just makes a good collectible and helps support this work. So if you are interested in that, the link to that will be in the show notes. Remember, you will have to be a member of the website, logged in order to purchase that special collectible data CD. Anyway, other than that, I hope you are all as excited about the revived film literature in the New World Order as I am. I'm trepidatious about it as well, but we'll see how it goes. But I think narrative is incredibly important, more important than we tend to give it credit for in our haughty geopolitical discussions. We don't tend to think about the ways that people's narratives are shaping their worldviews and what they see and don't see and the way that they act in the world. So let's see if we can explore this idea in greater detail. As always, I'm interested to hear your comments. So Corbett Report members, please log in, leave your comments on corbettreport.com in the post below. But in the meantime, and finally here today, I'm going to leave the last words to William Faulkner. I know I've played them here on the podcast before, but I think they are as apt now as they ever were. And I think we all need to hear and reflect on them at this particular juncture in world history. So this is the recording of William Faulkner reading his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in Literature. We'll leave it there for today. James Corbett, corbettreport.com. Thank you for joining me for today's exploration. I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the near future.
I feel that this award was not made to me as a man, but to my work, a life's work in the agony and sweat of the human spirit, not for glory and least of all for profit, but to create out of the materials of the human spirit something which did not exist before. So this award is only mine in trust. It will not be difficult to find a dedication for the money part of it commensurate with the purpose and significance of its origin. But I would like to do the same with the acclaim too, by using this moment as a pinnacle from which I might be listened to by the young men and women already dedicated to the same anguish and travail, among whom is already that one who will someday stand here where I am standing. Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. He must learn them again. He must teach himself that the basis of all things is to be afraid, and teaching himself that, forget it forever, leaving no room in his workshop for anything but the old verities and truths of the heart, the old universal truth, lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. Until he does so, he labors under a curse. He writes not of love but of lust, of defeats in which nobody loses anything of value, of victories without hope, and most of all without pity or compassion. His griefs grieve on no universal bones, leaving no scars. He writes not of the heart but of the glands. Until he relearns these things, he will write as though he stood among and watched the end of man. I decline to accept the end of man. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal simply because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny, inexhaustible voice, still talking. I refuse to accept this. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The poet's, the writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man. It can be one of the props, the pillars to help him endure and prevail.
The Deep State. False Flags. 9/11 Truth. The Federal Reserve. Secret Wars and Hidden Histories. Fake News. Medical martial law. Ceaseless propaganda. James Corbett. Reportage. Essays on the New World Order. Available where books are sold. Until they're not.
Reportagebook.com